Well, we are not going to get married because marriage is just a piece of paper, which is really a stupid thing to say. Like, it's an incredibly stupid thing to say. Well, go ahead. You live your life like that and see what you're like when you're 50. Jesus, it's dismal. 2 or 3 divorces, your family's fragmented. I mean, I bet you there's not a person in this room who hasn't rejected someone because they were too nice to them. Then you get to have a conversation. Right, and then you can solve the problem. But man, you gotta be a monster. Lots of times people come to me and they have relationship problems, and part of the problem is that they've set their relationships up outside of social norms. And they do that, so they'll say to me something like, well, we are not going to get married because marriage is just a piece of paper, which is really a stupid thing to say. Like, it's an incredibly stupid thing to say. But underneath that, there's this idea that they want to remain free of social constraints so that they can negotiate their own way. Like, if you're giving them credit for, wanting freedom instead of just escaping responsibility. But the problem with that is, it's like, okay, good luck, try it. I don't know why you would assume that you have enough time in the 30 or 40 years that you're going to be pursuing relationships to actually figure out how they should run. You don't have a hope of that. And it's worse too, because very, very few people can negotiate. Because here's the way it works. You either adhere to the social order or you stand outside of it. As soon as you stand outside of it, you're in a chaotic place because there's no guidelines. And then you either live chaotically because there's no guidelines, or you start to formulate order. But to do that, you have to know what you want. And you have to know how to express it. And then you have to figure out what your partner wants and help them express it, and then you have to negotiate a solution. Well, I would say 1 in 20 people know how to negotiate. It's really, really difficult. I mean, just think of the steps. First of all, you have to know what you want, and then you have to admit it to yourself. Well, yeah, right. Like, you're not even going to get to the first one in all likelihood. What do you want? A lot of what you want can't be articulated even. That's actually why people get married, just so you know. Because this is built into marital vows. I'm not leaving. Ever, no matter what. It's like, okay, well, that definitely puts a boundary around our arguments, right? Because I can't say every time you manifest one of your flaws, which you're likely to do just as often as me, well, enough of this. It's like, that's horrible, man. If your whole life is, well, every time you get out of line, I'm out of here. It's like, how the hell are you? First of all, you're not going to admit to ever doing anything wrong. Second, you're going to be you're like a scared cat the entire relationship because, well, who knows? It could just come to an end at any moment. It's like, people say, well, if the possibility of divorce is open, it makes you free. It's like, yeah, that's what you want. You want to be free, eh? Really? Really? So you can't predict anything. That's what you're after. It's a vow. And it says, look, I know that you're trouble. Me too. So we won't leave, no matter what happens. Well, that's a hell of a vow, but that's why it's a vow, right? That's why you take it in front of a bunch of people. That's why it's supposed to be a sacred act. It's like, what's the alternative? What's the alternative? Everything is mutable and changeable at any moment. Well, go ahead. You live your life like that and see what you're like when you're 50. Jesus, it's dismal. 2 or 3 divorces, your family's fragmented, you've got no continuity of narrative. And it's not good for the kids, not by any stretch of the imagination. And so it's a form of voluntary enslavement, I suppose, but it's also equivalent to the adoption of a responsibility. And there's more to it than that. If you can't run away, then you can solve your problems. Because it might be, okay, well, I'm stuck with you. So how about we fix things? Because the alternative is we're going to be in a boxing match for the next 40 years. That's the alternative. So, and you think you're going to fix problems without something like that hanging over your head? There isn't a chance. You'll just avoid them because that's what people do. It's really hard to solve problems, especially in a relationship. I'll give you an example. So, there's a great study done a while back on the prediction of relationship longevity. Okay, so here was the question. How many positive interactions per negative interaction do you have to have with your partner in order for the relationship to remain stable? Okay, so let's say you have 1 negative interaction to every one positive interaction, okay? Or maybe you have 10 negatives to every positive. Then you can imagine a different situation where you have 100 positive to 1 negative, right? Spanning the whole potential continuum. And you use that to predict relationship satisfaction and longevity. Well, you might think, well, God, obviously 100 positive to 1 negative is the preferable ratio, and so it's those people who, their relationship is nothing but constant compliments and bliss. They're the ones who last. It's not true. What you see is that there's an optimal ratio domain. If it falls below 5 to 1 positive to negative, then your relationship falls apart. It's too negative. And it's partly because people feel negative emotion more than they feel positive emotion. Because you can be hurt more than you can be pleased. And so one that's only 5 to 1 is too punishing, and people won't stay in it. But if you get above 11 to 1, it gets not punishing enough. And you think, well, what does that mean exactly? Well, if you're in a relationship and you only have 5 positive interactions to 1 negative interaction, then the relationship will end. It's too negative. But if you have more than 11 positive interactions to 1 negative interaction, then it also ends. And you think, well, that's pretty bloody peculiar. Why in the world would that be? Don't you want like 100 to 1 positive to negative interactions? And the answer to that is, what makes you think that you want a relationship so that you can be happy? It's certainly not the case. You know that too, because I bet you there's not a person in this room who hasn't rejected someone because they were too nice to them. It's more like you want someone to contend with. You don't want a pushover. You don't want everything just to be easy. And this is the sort of phenomenon that Kierkegaard was talking about when he talked about deciding to make things more difficult for people because that's what they need. You know this perfectly well, because if you go out with someone and they worship you and they dote on your every word and there's nothing but positive feedback coming from them, you lose respect for them almost instantly, and you go wander off and find someone who's more interesting. And part of the reason for that, I think, is that you want the person that you're with to challenge you, so that not only do you do reasonably well day together, so that you can coexist in the same space with a reasonable amount of peace, but you also want there to be enough tension in the relationship so that you're both involved in a process of mutual transformation. Fair enough, like you don't want to make everything into a war. I usually use a rule of 3. If we're interacting and you do something that I find disruptive, I'll note it. It's like potential dragon, gone. And I leave it be. And then if you do it again, I think, oh yeah, that probably wasn't merely situational, but I'll leave it be because that's still not enough evidence. But if you do it a 3rd time, then I'll say, hey, I just noticed this. And you'll say, no, that didn't happen. And I'll say, yeah, not only did it happen, but it happened here and it happened here, and I'm not making this up. So there's something going on here, like I'm not ignoring it, and we can get to the bottom of it. And then they'll come up with a bunch of objections about why that isn't necessary, and you push those aside, and they'll come up with a few more objections, and they'll push those aside, and then usually they'll get mad or burst into tears, and if you push that aside, then you get to have a conversation. Right, and then you can solve the problem. But man, you got to be a monster, because first of all, you need 6 arguments about why their objections aren't going to stop you, and then you have to not be intimidated by the anger, and you have to not be swamped by compassion about the tears, and then you can have a conversation. And people don't do that. They won't do that. And so they don't solve the problems, and so then the problems accrue, right? And if they accrue over 15 years of a relationship, then they end up fat, ugly, and in divorce court. There's some additional problems with divorce that people don't really grasp when they're young. Like the idea that you can be divorced once you have children, that's kind of a stupid idea, because you can't. You can find a limited substitute for your initial freedom. But if you have kids and you try to get divorced, the probability that that's going to demolish your life is very, very high. First of all, it's incredibly expensive. So one or both of you is going to come out of that poor. And your market value has declined. Let's say you're the woman who takes the kids. Your market value has declined radically. You're going to be poorer. The man, he's just as screwed, because he is now an indentured servant and there's no escape from it. So it's not so bad if you can negotiate a peaceful separation, and some people can, but lots of times if you have a terrible relationship, it's not like negotiating a peaceful separation is all that easy. But if you're at each other's throats, good luck to you. I think it's roughly equivalent to having non-fatal cancer. It is not pleasant. It's a 10-year process, 15-year process. It'll cost you $250,000, and it'll tear a big chunk out of your life. And also it will really disrupt your relationship with your kids. And you know, you bring kids into a step-parent family, they do not do as well. Step-parents are not as good parents as biological parents, and the data on that is clear. Now, obviously there are exceptions, because there are terrible biological parents, and there are wonderful step-parents. But if you look in aggregate, it's not that easy to care for children. You need everything you can binding you to them. And if they're someone else's children, mostly they get in the way of the person that you love, right? Let's say you have a child and I want to go out with you. Every second you spend with that child is the second you don't spend with me. And there's going to be a price for that. I'm not going to be happy about that. And if I have a child, you're going to feel exactly the same way. You might say, well, no, I love children. It's like, yeah, sure you do. I doubt it.